So we need more people like me. Like for example, like with the pandemic, I started doing same thing. Talking like all before it was like doing like Instagram. Just
I hope everyone's doing well.
Yes, thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Hope you're doing well also.
I'm having a good time on the last night of Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah, Rabbi.
Happy Hanukkah to you as well.
But
I'm just going to
everybody,
be here for the introduction of the class because I have to go to a Hanukkah party in New Jersey via Zoom.
I was going to say, if you're going to New Jersey, you've probably left it a bit late to leave, but Zoom makes everything possible.
Yep, I'm going to be with Cantor Jackie.
Very nice. All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. I have a ritual meeting at 7, so I want to make sure we have time. We're going to pick up where we left off, but I want to do a very, very quick recap of what we began to talk about last week before our Hanukkah celebration. And we are talking about the movements, the different varieties, flavors of Judaism, if you will. And as I explained last week, there's always been diversity in Judaism. It's never been monolithic. We've had bad diversity, idol worshippers versus the rest, rebels against the rest, the Sadducees, the Sicarii, the Essenes, the Karaites, the people who were different sectarian groups that were trying very explicitly, very deliberately to take Judaism from the base varieties and splinter it into a different direction. But we've had other very positive forms, or at least neutral forms of diversity. The 12 tribes, the city-rural splits, Kohanim, the rest of the others who were not Kohanim, and of course, most famously and most enduringly, the Ashkenazic, Sephardic, Mizrahic, the different types of Jews and cultures from around the world. And we talked about prior to the Enlightenment, which we'll discuss in more detail a little bit later, the communities all were made up of diverse compositions. Much like if you were to walk into any major American population center today and say, what are the people like in Orlando? You would find people of all types. You're not going to find a homogeneous, everybody is the same. Not politically, not religiously, not morally, not quality of person. You're going to find a huge variety. And that was what Judaism was like and Jewish communities were like for most of our history. It was simply the default. You lived with your community, and your community ran the entire range of different types of people. And in general, in my opinion, and the opinion of many historians, that is healthy. You might think that we want to get rid of the impudent ones. We want to get rid of the people who are not taking Judaism seriously enough. We want to get rid of the people who are not being strict enough, or the people who keep pushing for change, or the people who keep pushing for insert whatever it is you don't like. That wouldn't it be better if we all just agreed, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't make for a healthy species. It doesn't make for a healthy organism. It doesn't make for a healthy community. You need a community that has a variety of people who have interests and who have needs that are sometimes in conflict, because this prevents the community from collapsing in upon itself and becoming nothing more than an echo chamber. A community should always be asking you to think, what is best for people different than me? Not, what will this community do for me? That raising up of a person's perspective beyond themselves happens best when you have a community that is diverse. If you have a community that is made up of exactly the same type of people, the same ages, the same mentality, the same goals, then you end up with a very strong tendency to actually do damage to the community and to its own members, and to become very selfish, for the community to only do what its members think they want, rather than what might be best for Judaism or the broader sense of community. So how did we end up fracturing? How did we end up becoming broken? Well, we got broke by being free, which I know sounds weird, but freedom came to us in the 1800s, roughly the early 1800s, usually pegged to the Napoleonic conquest of Europe. When Napoleon came along, bearing with him the ideals of the French Revolution, if not its actual implementation, the basic idea was, look, we are all Europeans. Jews and Gentiles, French, Germans, Prussians, whatever, we are all Europeans. We should all have freedom, we should all have liberty, we should all have brotherhood. But for you Jews, that freedom is going to come with a price tag. And that price tag is going to be give up for your hope for returning to Israel as a state, give up your hope for an actual Messiah that will bring about redemption, give up the laws, the mitzvot that make you distinctive in day-to-day life, and give up altogether your sense of peoplehood. Now, why did all of these things need to be done? What was the point that the Europeans were trying to make during this time? Well, if we continue to hope for a return to Israel, a restoration of the Jewish state, which remember in 1800 was like not even on anyone's map. It was a total fantasy dream that there would be a Jewish state within 150 years. But even still, just having the hope of there eventually being a Jewish state, having the hope that Jews would be able to emigrate and leave Europe and go to that country, well, doesn't that kind of make it seem like you're not loyal to this country? If you're living in France, if you're living in Italy, if you're living in any of the European states, why do you keep saying, gee, I wish there was a Jewish state? Aren't you happy here? Aren't you part of our state? Isn't that a dual loyalty? And if that sounds familiar, yes, this particular attack on Jews continues to this day. It is very sad, as we'll talk about another time when we discuss Zionism in general. Theodor Herzl thought the establishment of a Jewish state would get rid of that form of Zionism. It has continued, and if anything, has only become worse. It is a shame, but people still think that a Jewish person would be loyal to Israel over loyal to their own country. We hear that line of attack, unfortunately, repeatedly, even in our own country of the United States. So as you can tell, this is an emotional point that has gone on for a long time. So obviously, say the Europeans, if you really want to be European, you have to stop hoping for Israel. Hoping for a Messiah, again, why are you hoping for redemption? Why are you hoping for this Redeemer that's going to come and save you? Do you not feel saved living here in France? Do you not feel saved living here in Holland? What are you going to be saved from? Are we the bad guys? Now, yes, actually, they were the bad guys, and anti-Semitism, both state-run as well as private and socially done, was rampant and violent. But the Europeans didn't want their feelings hurt every time we made a blessing asking for a Messiah to come and bring redemption to the world. It made us seem like we were ungrateful. And of course, that is part of the problem. We were supposed to feel grateful because they were letting us be in their country, which, by the way, proves that they did not really see us as having an equal claim to citizenship in the state. Joseph, you have your hand up.
Yes, I do. I have another question. Does this has also to deal with the issue that Rabbi Geiger, he brought up front that Jesus was a Jewish Messiah, and then the church they saw this as a scandal and they wanted to keep their church, the Jesus within the church, and not fathom the idea that he was part of the Jewish people.
Well, it's a different idea. When we get to our discussion of anti-Semitism, which is a later class, I'll be going into much more detail of the theology of anti-Semitism within the Catholic Church and also later within Protestantism. But it is rather ironic that they are asking us to give up our concept of a Messiah here for secular reasons, not for religious reasons. Even in the states where they had decided that freedom of expression and freedom of faith was part of their idea, France most notably, they still were opposed to our asking for a Messiah because of the secular implication that we were somehow ungrateful for what the state had done for us. Our distinctive laws, well, and this may sound familiar to modern discussions of immigration in our own country. If you live in this country, you need to act like us in every way. Now, this was especially acute within Europe. In the United States, we do at least have, as part of the myth of our country and the feeling of our history, that we are a nation of immigrants. But in France, in Germany, Italy, England, Holland, all of these places, they were wrapping their head around the concept of identity as a nation, identity as a people, that was becoming disassociated, detached from who your king was. And in the process of doing that, they were building identity around culture. And they saw our cultural markers, our mitzvot, our commandments, as being a barrier to our entry to their culture, to blending together with their culture, and therefore we would be too distinct to be absorbed within the citizenry of their country. We had to talk, we had to speak, we had to eat, we had to dress, we had to look like them on the street in every way, or else we weren't really one of them. And that was a problem that we needed to fix before they would give us this right. And of course, all of this together, it's not surprise that they also wanted us to give up our sense of peoplehood, right? The people of this country, meaning France, England, Holland, whatever, this is your country, right? Not the people who you may share a religious affiliation with, who live in the next country over, right? If you are French and a Jewish person comes from Germany, if France and Germany are at war, we expect you to hate the Jewish person from Germany because you are French, not Jewish, and you don't share that with them. And indeed, we can see that within European society, people had waged war upon their co-religionists for 2,000 years almost at this point. So for them to attack and to hate people who shared a religion was perfectly normal. Indeed, they just finished many decades of war at this point, fighting over Protestantism and Catholicism. So they could not understand why we would look at Jews who lived in other countries and around the world as being part of our group when they did not look at Christians who lived around the world in the same way. Again, as a umbrella view. Obviously, there are Christians both then and now who do look at Christians in that way, but that was not, by and large, the way that European politics and history played out. So all we had to do, they said, was give this up, right? Give up our distinctiveness, give up our peoplehood, give up our hopes of redemption, our hope of Messiah, and you too can become a good European of your country. And that's all we're asking. And then we will give you full protection of the law, full participation in civil society, and we'll stop treating you like dirt. That was the bargain. So what do you think? A good idea? Not such a good idea. Well, let's hear from some of the thinkers of this time period about what they thought of this idea. All right, so first we begin with Johan David Michals. Again, not Jewish. One must mention something which casts doubt on the full and steadfast loyalty of the Jews to the state and the possibility of their full integration, namely their messianic expectation of a return to Palestine. The Jews will always see the state as a temporary home, which they will leave in the hour of their greatest happiness to return to Palestine. for similar reasons, their forefathers were suspect in the eyes of the Egyptians. All right, so we get a lovely little restatement of what I was trying to share, but this time in the flowery language of 1782. And we also see a sympathy that is being expressed with the Egyptians, whom you may remember enslaved us and murdered our children because they weren't sure if they could trust our loyalty. And here we are seeing that repeated, that as long as we hope for a return, then we shouldn't be treated as fully integrated members of the society. And so this was why we were being pressed to give up that choice. And the Reform Judaism, which began in the early 1800s, basically said, you know, we're going to take you up on this deal. We're going to take you up on this bargain. I need to point out, because it's often misunderstood, but the Reform movement that was in the early 1800s is very, very different than the Reform movement of the early 21st century. So if you walk into a Reform seminary, if you walk into a Reform synagogue, you will not find that it is in keeping with the ideals of the 1800s. Modern Reform is in fact much more traditional than early Reform Judaism was. We'll talk about why that is and how that happened a little bit later, but I want to make sure you understand that as we talk about Reform Judaism, we are talking here about classical Reform Judaism of the 1800s predominantly. So Reform Judaism in the 1800s is the first modern movement. Since the Karaites 1,000 years before, this is the first time somebody has picked up a flag and said, we are going to form a group of like-minded Jews who agree with certain principles and who will carve out our own mode of worship and life within our own institutions and will keep our community limited to those who believe in this. Now, the limitation wasn't that they were checking people at the door. The limitation was if people didn't agree with the changes they were making, they wouldn't have attended or participated. Now, this began in Germany, and we can see from the constitution of the Hamburg Temple, which was 1817, which is by the Reform movement at the time, that first and foremost, they are calling themselves a temple. This was part of rejecting the Messianic ideal and the return to Israel, because until this point, we never called our places of worship temples. There was only one temple, and it was in Jerusalem, and it was in ruins. But the Reform movement said, we're going to name our places of worship temples to show the Europeans that we're not looking for Jerusalem. We have our temple here in this country on this soil. So here is from their constitution. They plan to arrange in the city also for themselves as well as others who think as they do, a dignified and well-ordered ritual according to which the worship service shall be conducted. Specifically, there shall be introduced at such services a German sermon, a choral singing to the accompaniment of an organ. All right, so why are these points being spelled out in such detail? Why are they emphasizing that it will be well-ordered and dignified? Why specify a German sermon and why specify choral singing and an organ? Because all of those things were what Germans did. They weren't what Jews did at this point. They were what the non-Jewish Germans did. That is to say, they are trying to model their service on the services of of German Christians. So German Christians stand up, sit down in unison, they are silent, and then they sing together, and then they are silent. The sermon is given in German. When the sermon is done, everybody takes that message home. There is an organ to introduce awe. This was the structure of German Christianity. And so the German Jews were giving up their distinctiveness and giving up the markers that had been part of Jewish ritual to this point in order to fit in and be accepted. I should point out the dignified and well-ordered is specifically ironic. Up to this point, Jews, as we still do, see prayer as personal. That happens to be done in a community. And so if you get a large gathering of Jews who take their prayer seriously, it is a cacophony. It is nothing like dignified and well-ordered. Each person is on their own page, each person is saying their own prayer, and then it comes together for certain blessings and then goes back into private devotion. It is a very organic and messy experience. They wanted to get rid of that. And by the way, we in the modern American movements are inheritors of that. And we tend to have more organized services than we used to. And that is a holdover from some of these changes. I should also point out that sermons were not a regular part of services prior to this innovation. The rabbi did not get up and preach. That was a Christian idea. The rabbi was just a congregant on a regular Shabbat or any other service. And the rabbi would hold classes like we're doing now. The rabbi would meet with people and give instruction or give rulings. But the idea of taking time on a Shabbat for the rabbi to get up and speak in any language was simply not part of normal Jewish practice at that time. Joseph, your hand is up.
Yeah, and something that might be considered also is that Germany was the birthplace of the Protestant Reformation. And the way that the model of the service was created is following the Christian Reformed Protestant model. That's why it doesn't follow the Roman Catholic or the Methodist, Anglican, or Charismatic, because Germany is where the Protestant Reformation happened, so it follows more the Reform movement of Christianity.
Exactly right. Exactly right. It's if you walk into a classical Reform service back in the 1800s and you walk into a Protestant German service, you're going to find them looking very, very similar. If you walk into a Catholic service, it would look a little different. Mm-hmm. All right. So that was the first movement, right? Very, very important. Orthodoxy was not the first movement. Let me make sure we get that clear. Orthodoxy was not the first movement. Orthodoxy likes to claim that it is authentic, original Judaism as it has been since Moses. It is not. Orthodoxy is, and I don't mean this in the negative sense, but merely in the technical sense, a reactionary movement that was founded by those who were appalled and aghast at the Reform movement, right? They were people who decided to fight back against the changes, the reforms that were being made. And they fought back, as we're going to see from a few examples here from the Hamburg Rabbinical Court, which was what would become the Orthodox opposition to the Reform Temple. They fought back by making statements and making rules that were new. They were not only opposed to the changes of the Reform movement, they implemented their own changes in order to prevent Reform changes. So it is not fair to say that Orthodoxy is against change. Orthodoxy was founded by changing Judaism to go against the changes of the Reform movement. So change, despite what they're going to claim here, is simply not what they are opposed to. It is the wrong sort of change in their mind that they are opposed to. So let's take a few examples of what the rabbinic court said about their Reform brothers and sisters down the street. It is forbidden to change the worship that is customary in Israel from Birkot HaShachar to Aleinu, and all the more so to make any deletions in the traditional liturgy. So they are saying you cannot change any part of the prayer service from Birkot HaShachar, the preliminary service, 9:30 at Temple Israel, until Aleinu, at the very end of the service. Now, this is incredibly ironic because both Birkot HaShachar and Aleinu are changes. If you read through the history of Jewish prayers and you go back 1,000 years, we were not doing those services, those prayers together in a service. The morning blessings were done on our own, and there was a variety of different ways that it was done and a variety of texts that were included. And Aleinu was added later as a conclusion. And if you go to the Sephardic communities, you don't see Aleinu nearly as often either within those communities. So they are saying it is forbidden to change the customs, even though they are using as citations from beginning to end of two things that were definite changes over the course of Jewish history. So what are they really saying? We don't want anyone else to change what we have already changed. They are not saying that change has never happened. They are simply saying now we're putting on the brakes. We've reached the perfect form. Nothing else needs to be changed. And it's simply not true of how Judaism has existed for its history, but in order to protect their social structure, this was one of the changes they felt was important. Part 2, it is forbidden to pray in any language other than the Holy Tongue, meaning Hebrew. Every prayer book that is printed improperly and not in accordance with our practice is invalid, and it is forbidden to pray from it. So, do you have to pray in Hebrew? What does the Mishnah say? What does the Talmud say? No, of course not. You pray in the language you understand. Those of you who have followed our discussions in Mishnah class for Sota will know that the last chapter of that Mishnah was all about which things had to be in Hebrew and the fact that everything else that wasn't on that list did not. And everything in prayer, except for basically the Shema, can be in any language that you are fluent in. And the rabbis were very clear that was what was important. The person had to know what they were saying. They had to feel the meaning of the words. And if that was best accomplished in a different language, then do it in a different language. We encourage Hebrew. We want Hebrew, of course. We have for thousands of years. But prayer has always been allowed to be done in whatever vernacular was convenient for the prayer.
And Rabbi,
here they are changing it to forbid it. Why? Because they see the introduction of German as being the change of the social order. Yes, Joseph.
That also is a contradiction because one of the main prayers in Judaism, the Kaddish, is Aramaic.
Absolutely, right. I mean, we use non-Hebrew in our prayer anyway, Aramaic being the most famous in not only the Kaddish, but also in Yakum Porkan, the last paragraph of Yakum Porkan, and also in Be'ana Rachetz, the blessing we say when we have the ark open. We use Aramaic in all of those places as well. 3, it is prohibited to play a musical instrument in the synagogue on Shabbat and on the festivals, even when it is played by a non-Jew. There technically should be no problem with a non-Jew playing it, even according to the most strict interpretations. But again, they are implementing a change in order to protect their interpretation of the social structure. Now, we can understand their reaction. We can understand their apprehension, their fear, because they are looking at what the Reform movement is doing. Again, 1810 Reform movement, not modern Reform movement, and saying, you're becoming indistinguishable from Christians. You are becoming not Jewish. I mean, sure, you're using quotes from our Bible, but so do Christians. And yes, you're giving lip service to Torah, but everything external is being remade, which was, of course, the point of the early Reform movement. And if we do that, they were very worried, then being Jewish will simply stop. That we will lose the continuation of our people. That the threat of modernity, the threat of assimilation was so great that they had to build these barricades to keep it from happening. And so they erected these prohibitions. They made these changes in the name of stamping out changes that they didn't like. And last on the scene, the conservative movement. Well, last of the major movements. There are other movements that have come since, but we're going to just focus on these these three primary movements. Conservative Judaism began roughly in 1886. It began primarily in America, although it included teachers and ideas that came from Europe as well. So the idea within the conservative movement was, we don't change to fit in, and we don't change to prevent change. We try to maintain the course that Judaism has had for the last 2,000 years, which is change happens when change is necessary, but never for its own sake. And we never avoid change just for its own sake. We walk the tightrope balance of trying to be very careful and very judicious of introducing novelty and of protecting tradition. Or it's said better than I can do, maintaining the integrity of Judaism simultaneously with progress. This is the essential problem of the present. And I will point out it is still the problem in the 21st century. Where is the point where the two apparent contraries can meet? The viewpoint of the Orthodox is clear. Where else, save in the meticulous observance of the precepts, can it find that complete satisfaction? this party, he's referring to the Reform, sees salvation in overcoming the past, in carrying progress to the limit, in rejecting religious forms and returning merely to the simple original idea, meaning that the commandments aren't important, it is the feeling behind the commandment that's important. So who cares about keeping Shabbat? Who cares about keeping kosher? Just focus on the idea behind them, and you can break the commandments in any way you think is appropriate. And indeed, in the early Reform movement, that was the norm. Frankel continues, we will now turn to a third party, what we would call the conservative movement, although it didn't have that name just yet, which has arisen from the first and recognizes that the task of Judaism is religious action, but demands that this action shall not be empty of spirit and that it shall not become mechanical, right? Yes, we need to be careful and meticulous in the performance of the commandments. That is essential for Judaism to become Judaism. It is a religion of action. But just keeping it mechanically is not right. That spirit that the Reform movement is talking about, yes, we agree. There needs to be the idea within the commandment as well. Those need to work together. Furthermore, it holds that we must omit certain unimportant actions that are not inherently connected either with the high ideas or with the religious forms delineated by the revealed laws. Right? Yes, change happens. Sometimes we delete or modify custom and practice in order to match the current situation of life, but we are very careful when we are shaping, like gardening a bonsai tree, that what we are shaping and the direction we are making it flow does not leave the high ideas, nor does it go against the actual laws that God has given us. This third party then declares that Judaism must be saved for all time. It's very, very important in conservative Judaism that we are not only deciding now how to do Judaism to protect now, but the Judaism we try to defend is a Judaism we believe has its roots in antiquity, has changed and evolved and adapted over the centuries, and will continue to do so in the future. And that if we bind it to one particular form right now, whether it be the 1880s, the 1980s, or the 2080s, then we will be essentially paralyzing its ability to continue to be living in the future. And likewise, if we give in to whatever we think is appropriate just off the cuff for now, then we will also be jeopardizing Judaism for the future. This was a major summary of the issues that conservative Jews had with both Orthodoxy and the Reform movement. Conservative Judaism affirms both the divine value and historical basis of Judaism, and therefore believes that by introducing some changes, it may achieve some agreement with the concepts and conditions of the time, right? Judaism continues to live in its moment while drawing the wisdom from the past and building a path to the future. All right, questions on the summaries of the different movements. All right, and this is essentially where we still are philosophically. Like I mentioned, the Reform movement has changed greatly. Part of its change has been because of the establishment of Israel. More on that later. Part of that has been because they recognized that it wasn't working. That if you turned Judaism into Christianity with a Star of David rather than a cross, that people eventually stopped going to Judaism. Right? What was left that was unique that would make a person go to it? It'd be like if you were to open a restaurant next door to McDonald's and make sure that your menu was as close to McDonald's as possible, but call your restaurant Whackdonald's, with the M turned into a W. Why would anyone choose to go to yours rather than the other? There was no distinctiveness within that early Reform movement, and eventually assimilation was such a threat that they began to recognize that it needed to be distinct. In addition, I think that their different leaders also began to realize that people need a structure, people need direction. People cannot simply be told, do what you think is meaningful to you, and know what is meaningful. You need to be given a structure when you are young. You need to be raised in a community which declares what it values and which puts that into action. And you need to be given information. Even if you allow individual choice, there needs to be more of a beginning foundation for people to build on, rather than simply saying, do what you like. So the Reform movement has reintroduced much more Hebrew. It has reintroduced much more tradition. The most recent Reform prayer book is almost identical in its Hebrew content, at least, with the conservative prayer book. That has been a radical change. I grew up in a Reform congregation until I was 13, and I can tell you that the people who were the old folks in the synagogue I grew up in would look at the modern Reform service and the modern Reform prayer book and think that it was Orthodox. It does not resemble the wide open Wild West of Reform Judaism that was found in really until the middle of the 20th century. All right, so let's sorry, questions or comments? Yes.
Joshua?
Yes.
Okay. We tried in that Reform synagogue, because we had a very heavy school, I mean, big school, and a lot of Hebrew. We tried to integrate, and we said, can we do not a separate family service, but can we do the children with the older people? And we were told that older people know what we were doing. Okay, so we always had to keep it separate because they're all in English and ours was mostly in Hebrew. So even in one congregation, you could see this big division.
Exactly. I should point out, for those who don't know, Charlene Neely is my mother, and she also was the education director of that school in the Reform synagogue that I was talking about. So we share a lot of memories of how that has changed over the decades. For example, when I was there, my brother and I and my mother were among the only people, except for the clergy, who wore a talit in the entire building, because no one else considered that to be important. However, when I went back for my nephew's bar mitzvah about 6 years ago, I was surprised because synagogue, my brother was still a member at that time before they left the town. The synagogue now had much more Hebrew. People were wearing talits. It had changed radically, even since when I was a child. And I think you'll find that to be true of most Reform congregations these days. All right, we've only got 20 minutes left, so I'm going to have to try and cram in a lot of information. But these are some of the places where there is a disagreement. You may have heard people say that the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox are a spectrum of how strict you are. That's not correct. Yes, there is a certain tendency regarding strictness, which is more of a philosophical decision and more of a personality decision than it is an actual position paper. You can't just line us up in a row and get a clear expectation of left, middle, right on any of these topics. So we're going to break it down into more detail on some of the main issues of Judaism. Revelation, the Reform view. The Torah is a record of the Jewish people's relationship with God, right? Emphasis on it's our record. It has changed over time, and not all of its words should be seen as eternally true, right? Yes, it may have been true 2,000 years ago, or it may have even been wrong 2,000 years ago, says the Reform movement. We can ignore those things now. Some were only true for other generations, some were human interpretations and thus limited. So the Reform movement has no difficulty looking at certain passages in the Torah and saying, no, right? That was man-made, that was man-instituted, or that was only appropriate at an outdated generation. We don't even need to consider that for today. The conservative movement. We have a much broader range of views within the conservative movement. So there are people who have lots of different ideas. This is sort of the generic conservative view. So if you meet a conservative teacher or thinker that has a slightly different version, that's fine. We do have a lot of variety on this topic in our movement. The Torah we have is the Torah God wants us to have. So we believe in the divinity of the Torah. Every word is divinely true and eternal. We also believe that we don't get to delete or edit parts of the Torah. However, our ability to understand is still growing, but nothing in the Torah can be ignored or erased. So if we find a passage that we think is difficult, or if we find a passage that we think is outdated, it is not the Torah's fault, it is our fault. Either we have not understood it well enough yet, or we continue to understand it incorrectly, or we simply need to continue our research. The conservative movement believes that the Torah we have, and there's a wide variety of how we ended up with it, that's a discussion for another time. We believe that the Torah we have is the Torah precisely as God wants us to have. And therefore, all of it must be taken seriously in one form or another. But our ability to read, interpret, and study, that continues to grow and change over time. The Orthodox view, the Torah we have was given in a literal series of dictations between God and Moses. Anything else is not allowed. Its interpretation is fixed and unchanging for all time. Now, this is a philosophical position, which in my opinion is also untenable, right? Interpretation cannot be fixed and unchanging for all time because time continues to change and demand interpretation for its day. However, as a matter of principle, the Orthodox do not encourage the idea that we must continue to interpret and apply. Instead, the Torah is considered to be a fixed object around which the world must be forced to conform. Really, there is more of a give and take in that process than they would admit, in my opinion. Israel, as in the state of, the modern state on a particular piece of land in the Eastern Mediterranean. Remember, Israel in general is a word meaning all Jews, but since the beginning of Zionism, and especially since 1948, it's been more associated with geography. Classical Reform, again, we're talking about the early days of the Reform movement. The land of Israel is part of our history, but not our future. We are citizens of other countries now and have no desire to return or rebuild. As I mentioned in the beginning, that was what they felt was the price tag for entry into European society, and they made good on paying that price. They could care less, and they, in fact, were opposed to Zionism as a political movement, really all the way up into the establishment of Israel itself. Modern Reform Judaism, on the other hand, has changed its attitude greatly. Israel is our homeland, and it's the homeland of our people, and we should support it. They don't necessarily make a religious statement about it, but they see it as being an important cultural or civilizational marker for our brothers and sisters around the world. And therefore, yes, we should support Israel and recognize it as such. We don't need to hold it at arm's length. The conservative movement has always been the movement with the strongest and longest ideological commitment to establishing a state in Israel. And we believe that we long for the liberation of Israel and support all those who rebuild it. One day it will be the center of a global redemption. We will never turn our back on Israel. The conservative movement is the only movement that has consistently maintained this policy. Orthodoxy, it's complicated, right? Many rabbis reject the modern state of Israel. Even today, the many more rejected the idea during the 1800s and early 1900s. During the time leading up to the Holocaust, many of the Orthodox leaders refused to allow their people to go to Israel or America. And unfortunately, many more died than should have if they had been allowed to leave with the blessing of their communities. But the modern state was being founded back in the late 1800s and early 1900s by people who were people, right? It was not the Messiah. This was not a divine action in the way that the Orthodox believe the divine action of redemption would happen. And as such, they believe, according to certain interpretations of Jewish tradition, that it should not be supported, that Jews should not go to Israel unless the Messiah established it himself. However, Israel happened, right? 1948, you've actually got a state. And now the Orthodox were sort of scratching their head of, well, how do we relate to it now that it is a real existence? So, since it exists, we should do what we can to make it conform to our vision of Judaism. So you will find the Orthodox in Israel very active in politics and very active in trying to implement laws on the entire state that conform to Orthodoxy. This continues to be a major issue, a major problem of how other Jews who are not Orthodox, and indeed about 80% plus of Israel is not Orthodox, how they can express their Judaism fairly within the land of Israel. That's a much more complicated discussion that we'll save for when we talk about Israel in more detail. The Messiah, remember, that was one of our big sticking points for redemption, for assimilation into Europe. The Reform movement, modern version. We do not wait for a person to redeem the world. God has already taught us what we need. The visions of the prophets are about a messianic age, as a spirit, when the Spirit of God will unite the world, not about an individual. Most Reform people today do not think of a Messiah. They think of the redemption, the age of the world coming to this full end of suffering. Conservative movement, we look for the Messiah who will inspire us and the world to draw closer to God, and thus end human suffering. So we share the idea that this will be the end of suffering. We share the idea that this will be a global phenomenon, but we do follow tradition until proven otherwise, that there will be a person as the nexus, a human being, flesh and blood, right? No sons of God metaphor here. A human being, flesh and blood, who will lead this revelation of ideas that will help people of all types focus in a way that prevents the ceaseless struggle, strife, and pain that we cause one another and ourselves. And the Orthodox, well, the Messiah will come from the house of David, literally a king of Israel, and bring redemption to the Jewish people through kingship and teaching. There is a much stronger emphasis on the Malchut, the kingdom being established by David, or a descendant of David rather, and the sort of reestablishment of the glory of the monarchical state at that time. And change in general. How do the different movements look at it? The Reform, you may already be able to anticipate this, the way Judaism has been practiced became stale and mechanical. Change helps revive the spirit and move us closer to God. It is a good thing. Now, this is again the opinion of the philosophers, the opinion that people would say if they were discussing it. However, in practice, I will say from personal experience as well as from sociological observation, communities don't like change. My mother can chime in. She's already mentioned about trying to change the service to include more Hebrew and the opposition that she faced. But I remember also another example where they had used a guitar during services and somebody wanted to introduce another instrument along with it. And many people objected because we've always used just the guitar, right? Changing from the guitar to guitar plus was a problem. Similarly, if you add in new melodies, you'll often find people objecting. Why aren't we singing Vishamru the same way? I don't want to learn a new melody. And I've talked with my Reform colleagues in different synagogues, and they face that problem all the time. They believe that change is good and helps revive the spirit, and they get pushback every time they bring a new melody or bring an interpretation or bring a new reading. People want what they're used to. So this is the ideal, but not always what happens in practice. Conservative movement. Change is neither good nor bad by itself. Judaism has always adapted to new cultures and situations. Change isn't a goal to be pursued. Change isn't something to be avoided. It should be organic and well studied. We don't change at a moment's notice. We don't wait too long to change, although obviously people will have a different opinion about both of those time measures. And we don't want to be more lenient. We don't want to be more strict. What we want to do is find what we believe is the right thing to do for us, our community at this moment. And that is a bit of a moving target. And that's something that makes many people uncomfortable. There is an old joke that the Reform movement is lazy, the Orthodox are crazy, and the conservatives are hazy, that we are fuzzy. We're fuzzy because you cannot lock Judaism into a crystal form for more than just one moment and one community. You simply cannot paralyze it to take pictures. Life is changing and evolving, and every community has too much going on in it to ever freeze Judaism as it is in one moment. So yes, we are hazy as a collective, but we are very clear in each individual. And Orthodoxy, the way Judaism has been practiced, must be protected at all costs, even if that means being stricter than our ancestors. It's very surprising to people whenever I teach them traditional Jewish law, halakha, and I take them through the observance of Shabbat or the practices of keeping kosher, just as two very technical examples. They will be surprised that when you read something from 1,000 years ago, it is much more liberal than something written by a modern Orthodox author. If you were to take a modern Orthodox person and put them into a kitchen that was identical to that of Maimonides, Rambam, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of all time, from 1,000 years ago, they would not feel that kitchen was kosher, that it was not good enough. So they indeed have embraced a type of stringency that was unknown to our ancestors. They believe protective change is okay, but all other types of change is bad. Right? Remember, they are trying to protect what they believe is the social core of Judaism. And in order to do that, they must erect barriers to outside influences and recoil from those influences and making sure that things don't change at all. And finally, we come to the topic of authority. Right? Authority is really the question of who makes these decisions? Who is implementing all of this idea of what it is to be a good Jew? In the Reform movement, philosophically, the individual is the sole authority for knowing what God wants him or her to do. The community and the rabbi can instruct, but not dictate. So if the community says, keep kosher, and you don't want to keep kosher, you're not doing anything wrong. Right? You're not breaking a commandment. You are not transgressing. You are perfectly fine with your relationship and God because you have made that decision not to think, just to think that that particular commandment doesn't apply to you in this day. The conservative movement, only those trained in Jewish law can make binding decisions for a community. Individuals must study to know those decisions and know how to apply them for themselves. Communities can choose their own rabbi. So if you want to know what the law is, you read, you study, you talk to your rabbi, and you find out what the rules are within your community. There is, of course, a huge amount of overlap within the conservative movement of what you'll find as normal in all these communities. But it is technically a local decision. And we also expect you to make decisions for yourself. When you are in business and you want to know whether something is fair and just, you can always check with me. But first, you should be trying to learn those rules on your own and with the classes that I teach in order that you will be able to make those decisions for yourself. In the Orthodox world, local rabbis can answer routine questions, right? Is pork kosher? No. But real decisions can only be made by the Gedolei Hador, the greats of the generation. They alone have real authority. If you want to know whether an iPhone is kosher, you can ask your local rabbi, but he's just going to ask the teacher that he studied under, who will ask the teacher he studied under, until you reach the highest authority within their particular group of Orthodox. They're not going to make an innovative decision without consulting higher up the chain of authority. That is something that is very new in Judaism. Classically, Judaism does not have a pope. Judaism does not have a system of hierarchy from top to bottom. We don't answer to higher levels. Yes, we respect higher levels and people who have learned more than us. We respect the people who have positions that give them a perspective and that show that they have been very good at making decisions. But if the great ones of the conservative movement make a decision to say that go left, and I think that for Temple Israel we need to go right, I don't get kicked out of the movement. and they don't call me a heretic for doing so. They recognize that that is the decision that applies for Temple Israel. And if my community doesn't like the fact that I said right rather than left, they can get rid of me. And that has been the norm for Jewish history. Right? It is unusual in the modern world. You'll see Orthodox rabbis, most famously, for example, Chabad, who own their synagogue and then let people come to it. That is completely different than the last 2,000 years of Jewish history. For our history, the people own the synagogue and they engage the rabbi to be the teacher and judge for their religious issues. And if they don't like what they're hearing, they find a different one. And that has been a back and forth relationship. Rabbis often will do things that make people annoyed, but sometimes with very good cause. But it is then up to the rabbi to convince people that it is the right thing to do rather than to get kicked out of the community. And vice versa, a community that continues to ignore their rabbi will eventually find that their rabbi will walk away and they will be left without anyone to lead and guide them. So it is a good mutual relationship, in my opinion. And that is going to finish our survey of the different movements. Obviously, as always, there is much more to be said about all of this. There's a great book by Sarna called American Judaism, which gives a much better view of the American experience. Elliot Dorff, Rabbi Elliot Dorff, one of my teachers, wrote a great book on American Judaism and for our descendants, our ancestors to descendants. I can't quite remember the title. Also goes into much more detail about the different movements. But if you have other questions, please let me know. I think I've got about a minute and a half before I have my next meeting. Any
Thanks,
questions?
Rabbi.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, one more very important point I always forget, but I need to make. If you find yourself saying, well, you know, this Orthodoxy thing sounds pretty good, or this Reform sounds pretty good, that's okay. Right? I am not going to be offended, especially if you are somebody who is interested in converting and want to become Jewish. If you would be happier in an Orthodox setting, I can put you in touch with an Orthodox rabbi. If you would be happier in a Reform setting, I can put you in touch with them. That's okay. It's more important to find a place for both people who were born Jewish and who are becoming Jewish, that you can be passionate and you can be serious in your dedication to Judaism. And you can be a passionate, serious, committed, real Jew in all three of these movements. All right, everyone, take care. Hanukkah Sameach. Enjoy the final night.